So, you've been told to go to hell, but you weren't given any instructions on how to get there. Rude. You've probably also been left wondering, well, which one? Not to worry, I've got you taken care of. My previous video on how to go to hell in every religion covered 5 major world religions: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Judaism. But this time around, we're going even deeper. Over the past few months, I spoke to scholars and educators in the field of religious studies to find out how to get into the hells of some of the most influential but relatively smaller religions of Jainism, Mormonism, Old Norse religions, Shinto, and Zoroastrianism. We'll start with Mormonism, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For this, I spoke to the internet's favorite scholar of the Bible and religion, Dr. Dan McClellan. Dr. Dan McClellan, thank you for joining me. I'm sure that a lot of my viewers know who you are, but for those who don't, can you just introduce yourself?
I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a public scholar of the Bible and religion, got my doctoral dissertation from the University of Exeter, and I work on social media. I'm across a bunch of different social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram and Twitter or X or whatever, and Blue Sky and Threads and YouTube and all the normal places. And then I also co-host the Data Over Dogma podcast with my friend Dan Beecher, and am out here trying to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also combat the spread of misinformation about the same. And relevant to our discussion today, I am also an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I am a Mormon.
So for those who don't know, again, maybe people don't. I imagine people would, but for those who don't know about the Mormon Church or the LDS Church, can you just give us a little background? What is the LDS Church?
Yeah, it was founded in 1830 by a small group of people. The leadership was made up of Joseph Smith and some close friends. The story starts with Joseph Smith claiming to have a revelation when he was 14 years old, where an angel visited him and came back every year for a bit, talking about a record that had been preserved from ancient peoples that had occupied the American continent, and he was going to go retrieve that record at some point, which was engraven on gold plates, and when he did, he was given the task of translating it through the gift and power of God, and the product was the Book of Mormon, which he then used as one of the central pieces of Scripture alongside the Bible, as well as with other revelations that Joseph Smith published, such as the Doctrine and Covenants, and a text that would later become known as the Pearl of Great Price, which primarily constitutes a revised version of the beginning of Genesis that Joseph Smith produced, and some other texts. And so it's a part of the Restorationist movement of the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century that tries to go back to early Christianity and restore the priesthood authority that Latter-day Saints believe had been established with Jesus Christ and with others in the early years of Christianity before what Latter-day Saints refer to as the Great Apostasy, which is where the priesthood authority was taken from the earth and would then later be restored through Joseph Smith and other leaders within the church. And it has grown since then, and now is one of the minority religions that is spread around the world and continues to engage in proselytization, missionary work in a lot of parts of the world.
I want to say for the record, for those who might be wondering about this in this video, I put the LDS Church on this list of minority religions because they have a distinct history and theology. It's not because I'm trying to say they're not part of Christianity. I personally would say they, from my sociologically informed perspective, the LDS Church is a part of Christianity, and I happen to know, from just following your work, you also say that, the LDS Church is a part of Christianity, but they do have a distinct theology, which I think is very much worth talking about in its own right.
Yeah, and I think there are, particularly online, you will find Christians who insist that Latter-day Saints aren't Christians, but there's an awful lot of research, sociological research, even Pew Religious Landscape surveys and things like that have consistently and repeatedly found that the majority of people who identify as Christians accept Latter-day Saints as Christians. It's primarily the folks who are like, I need to be online arguing with people about Christianity who have the strongest feelings in the opposite direction.
Before we continue, let me tell you about something that may or may not be going to hell as you watch this video. The separation of church and state in the American educational system. Not too long ago, the state of Oklahoma's Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional for a religious school in the state to receive public funding. Now, Oklahoma's charter school board is petitioning for the U.S. Supreme Court to take the case. Nearly 20 articles have been published on this, and different sources are portraying this story quite differently. While sources in the center state that the charter school has asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take the case, right-leaning sources frame the previous court's decision as a denial of religious freedom. Small differences in phrasing like this can easily influence public perception. I was able to easily compare these perspectives on the amazing news aggregator app, which I actually use every single day, Ground News. Go check them out at ground.news/skeptic. They've got a custom My News Bias dashboard, which lets you keep track of your personal reading habits and shows you your news blind spots. The type of sources and narratives we gravitate toward most can skew our news consumption, and this feature keeps me mindful of that. With Ground News, it's easy to diversify how I stay up to date. I can follow the topics I want to stay on top of, like religion and the U.S. Supreme Court, while still having access to the full spectrum of perspectives. This ensures that I have a more well-rounded understanding of any issue. Do yourself a favor and check it out at ground.news/skeptic, or scan this QR code to try a better way to read the news. Subscribe through my link for 50% off the Unlimited Access Vantage subscription, which is what I use. Don't let crafty headlines get the best of you. Take advantage of the tools Ground News provides to get the full story and get properly informed every time you read the news. Okay, so with that said, can you paint us a picture of what happens when people die in the LDS tradition?
Yeah, there's a drawing that a lot of Latter-day Saints learn in as they're growing up in their primary classrooms. Where there's a depiction of this line that depicts death, and then after death, based on a general assessment of your behavior in life, you either go to paradise or to spirit prison to await the final judgment, and following this final judgment, the pleasing bar of God, as it is referred to in Latter-day Saints scripture, you are assigned to one of three different, what Latter-day Saints call degrees of glory, kingdoms. The celestial kingdom is the one at the top, which facilitates what exaltation or continued progress towards godhood. The middle kingdom is what Latter-day Saints call the terrestrial kingdom, and then the third kingdom, the last kingdom, is called the telestial kingdom. And all of these are considered degrees of glory. There are sayings from Latter-day Saint history that if anyone could catch a glimpse of the telestial kingdom, they would take their own lives just in order to get there, because as a degree of glory, it is more sublime and than anything anyone could experience on earth. And then the closest that the formal articulation of post-mortem divine punishment gets to the classical Christian concept of hell is what Latter-day Saints call outer darkness, which is described as reserved really for the devil and his angels and the son of perdition, and you would have to try phenomenally hard and be in exceptional circumstances and be an exceptional case to even be able to achieve consignment to outer darkness within Latter-day Saint soteriology. And so for all intents and purposes, that's not really an option for people. And so there's a sense in which within Latter-day Saint soteriology, it is quite close to a brand of universalism, that everybody is going to enjoy some degree of heaven. Although it's divided into three main divisions, and then within the celestial kingdom they talk about additional divisions, and only in the celestial kingdom there are certain privileges and rights that they get to enjoy that others don't. But and oddly enough, despite everyone being taught this throughout their conscious lives, Mormons tend to kind of toggle back and forth between treating hell according to the classical Christian concept and according to what's actually official Latter-day Saint doctrine, which is something that developed secondarily. Like the Book of Mormon refers more regularly to the classical Christian concept of hell. The idea that we have now took years to develop within the Latter-day Saint tradition. And so just like Christians and others negotiate with different features of their faith, Mormons negotiate as well, and the concept of hell that they might come up with in any given circumstance is going to be situationally emergent. If it's rhetorically useful for Mormons to refer to the classical Christian concept of hell with the pitchforks and the red forked tail individual, like sometimes they'll do that. But if it is rhetorically useful for them to say, oh, no, everybody's going to achieve some degree of glory, Latter-day Saints will frequently do that as well. So it's a bit of a grab bag when it comes to what kinds of circumstances are catalyzing the need to talk about the concept of post-mortem divine punishment.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question, which is what kind of diversity of thought do we find within the LDS Church, or even, churches that have branched off from the LDS Church?
There is quite a bit of diversity, and even within the LDS Church that's centered in Salt Lake City, you have people who think and talk about it in a variety of different ways, again, depending on the situation. Frequently in some of the more fundamentalist branches of Mormonism, there's kind of a retreat to a bit of a more fire and brimstone type conceptualization. But you also see a bit of annihilationism bubbling to the surface from time to time as well. There is a popular theory about the folks who are consigned to outer darkness that ultimately they're just going to stop existing. And there are others who will extend the boundaries of the outer darkness concept to try to engulf more of the folks who, within the more traditional conceptualization, would probably end up in the telestial kingdom. So the boundary that separates the third degree of glory from outer darkness, that's kind of negotiable for a lot of folks, and particularly the more towards fundamentalism someone is shearing, the more likely they are probably to try to expand the outer darkness domain as much as possible, just because that insularity, those clear and hard boundaries tend to be more important to those smaller fundamentalist groups. They tend to be a little more isolationist. They tend to be a little more quarantined from those around them, and so those boundaries are very important to their success and their perpetuation. And frequently, more clear punishments, particularly post-mortem divine punishments, are critical to leverage in order to maintain those boundaries.
Okay, so it's sounding like the LDS Church is focused on ethics when it comes to the afterlife. In some religious traditions, the afterlife that you go to, not so much bound up in the things that you do here on earth. If you die, you're going to go to such and such place for such and such reason. It doesn't have to do with your moral acts. But here it sounds like if you do certain things, you may go certain places. Is that right?
Yeah, there's actually quite a tension within Latter-day Saint soteriology between a kind of faith-only approach and a works-based salvation. There are an awful lot of Latter-day Saints who grew up in an environment where they were taught they needed to do every last thing that they possibly could, expend every last ounce of energy and effort to right behavior, or they would fall into the hands of the devil and they would be dragged down to hell. But there's also within Latter-day Saint soteriology an approach that is more grace-based, that is more like, hey, as long as you believe, that's what's necessary. You do what you can, but don't worry about the difference, because Jesus makes all that up. And there was a book, I think Stephen Robinson was the author, that was published. It was published back in the 90s, I think, that was popular for promoting more of a free grace approach to salvation within Mormonism, and that annoyed a lot of the hardliners within the church and even within church leadership, while it also helped a lot of folks who were raised under that hardline banner and suffered from an awful lot of anxiety. And I actually published a paper back in 2018 about a famous passage from the Book of Mormon, 2 Nephi 25:23, which says, "We know that it is by faith we are saved despite all we can," or excuse me, after all we can do. And that has been used as the main proof text for saying grace only kicks in once you've done all you can do, which is basically saying there's no such thing as grace. You have to do all you can do to earn salvation. That's how it's been interpreted throughout the 20th century. But this was written way back in the late 1820s. And I went through and looked at this phrase, after all we can do, in literature from the late 18th and early 19th century, and found that it frequently occurred in discussions about grace, and always with the same exact meaning, despite all we can do. And so my paper was arguing the original intent of this passage in 1830 America could not have been anything other than we are saved by grace despite all we can do, which is a reading that conflicts with the way Mormonism has historically approached the question. So as I started off my statements, there's a tension right now, and you have folks who want to side with the you have to do everything you can, and there are folks who want to side with the no, you just have to believe and grace takes care of the rest. And so it's not quite it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to be consigned to this or that or the other place, but within a Christian framework, Latter-day Saints kind of run the gamut from a works-based salvation all the way to a faith alone-based salvation.
Okay, so hypothetically, if I am trying my best to go to, let's say, outer darkness in the LDS tradition, what would I do? What would I do hypothetically to get there, to earn my spot?
Well, all of the standard things, drink coffee. That's actually pretty. That's not an incredibly serious one, but murder, sexual assaults, divorce, abortion, all of that kind of stuff will get you a lot of the way there. But the thing about outer darkness is one has to reject the Holy Ghost, which means, according to the Latter-day Saint perspective, one actually has to have received a confirmation of the gospel and basically have had some kind of spiritual experience involving God or Jesus or the Holy Spirit. And that's something that I think the majority of Latter-day Saints are pursuing, and very few, if any, have ever claimed to have achieved. Certainly have not probably honestly claimed to have achieved. So you really have to have stumbled upon pretty exceptional circumstances and received pretty exceptional experiences just to qualify for getting to outer darkness. And so if we take the traditional Latter-day Saint view of 3 degrees of glory and then outer darkness for those who reject the Holy Ghost, again, good luck trying to get to the outer darkness. Probably not going to make it.
All right. Well, Dr. Dan McClellan, thank you for joining me and enlightening me about this really, really interesting tradition. I think a lot of people are very interested in learning about Mormonism right now, and hopefully this has been a nice little a brief mini seminar about hell and just divine punishment in Mormonism.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and I hope it upsets an awful lot of people who think I have not done the topic justice.
Next up, let's dive into the hell of Old Norse religions, where the word hell actually originated. For this, I spoke to Dr. Jackson Crawford. Dr. Jackson Crawford, thank you for joining me. Could you introduce yourself professionally for people who aren't aware of you and your work yet?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I am Jackson Crawford. I taught subjects such as Norse mythology, Old Norse language, Icelandic sagas at various universities for about 10 years. I was at UCLA, then at Berkeley, then at Colorado. Since then, or since about the middle of that period, I've been making YouTube videos about these subjects and publishing translations of some of the original sources of Norse myth and sagas into English.
So for those who don't know, what are Norse religions? What's going on there? I'm sure that a lot of people have heard of those from shows like Vikings, but may not really know about this tradition then, now, except from like pop culture.
Yeah, and really what I have to do there is review a little bit about our sources, because our sources for this body of belief are not put to pen by people who believe in it. So what we have is our two main witnesses to pre-Christian Norse belief are two books called Edda, written down in Iceland in the 1200s. One is the Prose Edda, written by a chieftain named Snorri Sturluson, who wanted to record all the stories that he could about pre-Christian beliefs, mostly as a toolbox for people who wanted to compose more traditional Norse poetry. And then there is the Poetic Edda, which is a compilation of about 30 poems about the traditional gods and heroes, most of which, based on linguistic and other contextual evidence, probably do date from the pre-Christian period. But these are being written down in the 1200s by Christians, and Iceland was converted in 1000, and most of the other Scandinavian countries converted at about that time. So these aren't practicing pre-Christian believers, pagans if you want to call them that, heathens if you want to call them that. We actually don't know what they would have called themselves, given that heathen is a Christian designation for the religion, as is pagan. Practitioners of the reconstructed form of the religion today tend to call it Ásatru, which is Icelandic for faith in the Aesir gods. That's the gods like Odin and Thor. I've also seen other terms that some groups refer, like Fornsithur, which just means ancient path. But we don't know what the self-designation of the religion was. We're also in a funny position with this religion because what we have are stories, and we have nothing about practice, or nothing deliberately preserved about practice. So these Christian Icelanders in the Middle Ages who wrote these stories down apparently regarded their culture as pretty safely Christian, much the same way as Christian parents today might read their kids, from the big book of Greek myths about Hercules without expecting the kids to wind up believing in Hercules. Apparently people kept telling these stories about Odin and Thor and Loki, but they didn't think, apparently the cultural context was such that nobody took it seriously as religion anymore. So, but while we have some stories like, this is how the world was created, how it ended, or how it will end, how this fight or this quest or whatever happened, we never get explicit directions on this is how you sacrifice, this is how you pray, these are holidays that you need to keep, things like that. We have to infer those things to the extent that we can, sometimes from archaeological evidence, sites that look like they had religious significance, sometimes from hints in the literary record, things that characters do in traditional literature that seemed odd from the perspective even of their medieval writers. But we don't have a direct, unbiased, from the horse's mouth guide to this religion. Only maybe a little bit to its mythology, right? Which I'm distinguishing between stories versus practice.
So you mentioned, ancient practitioners and practitioners today. I think some people have the idea that, this religion or set of religions, set of traditions is just totally extinct. But we know that it's not exactly true. Is there still something like this that's practiced today? And if so, what kind of connection does it have to practice centuries ago?
Well, my position as an outsider to these modern practices is that they do not represent an unbroken continuation of the pre-Christian, pre-conversion religion. The entire population of Scandinavia was converted. And although that wasn't an overnight process, it was a process that happened a long time ago. And so it is a broken tradition. There are centuries in which this religion was not practiced. There are so many different groups, most of them very small, that practice their own various different versions of the reconstructed religion. Some are very conscious of what our original sources say and pay a lot of attention to archaeology. Some are a little bit more freewheeling, right? Just almost revelation religions in the sense that we're based on some leader who's handing something down. Some of the ones that are a little bit more textually, archaeologically faithful might be a little bit like the true pre-Christian religion was 1,000 years ago, but I don't know if we can ever know that. And I don't know what their numbers are. Given what I talk about on the internet, to me, they seem like a lot of people. I'm not sure that that's necessarily true. It's a decent... I feel like of the ones I interact with, I feel like a very large number actually are in Scandinavia. And a very large number are in English-speaking countries, and a very large number are in German-speaking countries. And then you have a little bit more outside of that. People actually all over the world that I've heard from who have taken an interest in this and some kind of spiritual inspiration from it.
Now, can you paint us a picture of what happens when people die in these religions, in this religion? Do we know anything about that?
Yeah. Drawing on the literary sources, it appears that by default you go to a place called Hell. Now that is H-E-L, one L, and Old Norse, Old Icelandic. This is in fact the same word that becomes English Hell, H-E-double-L. So these two languages are very closely related. Old Norse, when you're looking at it, you're really looking at like the great aunt, the great uncle of English, right? Because Old English and Old Norse are very, very closely related. Both languages take a pre-Christian word for the underworld where the dead go and convert that to a place where the dead go in Christianity. In English, of course, we just say hell, H-E-L-L, and mean this place of fiery torment, or at least that's sort of the modern Christian interpretation of it. In Scandinavia, hell, H-E-L, really does have more pre-Christian overtones. The typical term for the Christian hell that people use is helvete, punishments of hell. But that's sort of treated like a place name too by a lot of people. So hell, though, as at least as described in the Eddas, is not very much like your typical 21st century Christian picture of H-E-L-L. H-E-L is a shadow of our present day world. It's a place where people work, people sleep, people eat. All of that seems a little bit alien, I think, to a Christian conception of hell. And I think that part of what's going on with it is that they have a very physical conception of the afterlife. They don't talk about the soul going to hell or the soul going to Valhalla. They talk about the person going there. And it seems as though the grave itself is an extension of hell. When you're in the grave, you're in hell. You've been put underground, right? And hell just means, it comes from an Indo-European root that actually means cover. It's from the same etymological root as the seal in Latin, conceal. So it's the hidden place. The place is covered. As soon as you're underground, you're there. You're in hell, apparently. And we see that in old sources such as the saga of Hervor and Heidrek, where this woman named Hervor breaks into her father's burial mound and finds his corpse and talks to him. And they both talk about how they are in hell. Right? All she's done is go into his burial mound, but they are in hell because she's there. And of course, he's physically inhabiting his body still. And I think that this is, there's nothing particularly unusual about this, but it's very pre-modern. The notion that the body and the soul are not quite as separable as I think 21st century notions of these are. We see the same thing with the other afterlife, usually in English called Valhalla. The Old Norse word is Valhall. This is where you go exclusively if you are a man who dies in battle. Exactly what the rules are seem to be a little bit fungible. Can someone stab you? Does that count? Or do you have to be defending yourself? These things seem to be never quite consistently ruled on. But if you're a man who dies in battle, you get to go to Valhall. And we see other old sources, for example, the poem Helga Kvidda Hundiksbana, the second in the Poetic Edda, where there is a hero who dies and goes to Valhall, but in the evenings, he comes back to his burial mound to spend time with his wife. And she comes and he's a corpse when she encounters him, but he's still inhabiting the corpse, right? His body and soul haven't separated. So in the day, he's actually like literally riding to the homes of the gods and then riding back. I think that it's not uncommon in a pre-modern context of thinking about the afterlife, but I think that it's, in a way, I think the 21st century is very spiritual, quote unquote, in the sense that we're very willing to accept that, like, there's things that go on in your soul that aren't reflected in your body, but I don't think that they quite think about it that way.
In Abrahamic religions, which is what, most of my audience is going to be used to, ethical ideas or ethical practices are very much tied to where you go when you die. Do we see anything like that in this tradition?
A little bit, because the afterlife is kind of a reward. Valhalla is a reward for dying in battle. So the god Odin knows that he will die at Ragnarok, but because he is just obsessively trying to prevent it, he gets men to kill each other in battle on Earth. He's always stirring up battles, trying to get people to fight, because that's the only way he can harvest them for his army in Valhalla, which will help him fight his enemies at Ragnarok. So, I mean, you could see the Valhalla notion as encouraging this very hyper-martial, hyper-masculine attitude. You know, it's the way that I used to tell my students in myth classes is, you know, today, if I'm walking down the street and someone says, you know, hey, nice boots, jerk, you know, and he's clearly insulting me. Well, today, the right thing for me to do is ignore him and just walk past. But in this culture's attitude, if someone says that, I should fight him, right? Because if I die in battle, I was going to die that day anyway, right? And I think that's an important thing to note with the Norse, is that they believe that there's an inevitable day you will die, right? It is scheduled. Maybe how you die isn't, but there is a particular length to your lifespan, and it will end on a particular day. So if mine is October 16th, 2024, when we're recording this, then, and you know, and somebody insults me out on the street, I should fight him, because if he kills me, well, I was going to die anyway. I was just going to come home and a piano was going to fall on me from, you know, the floor above me. And then I'd be in hell. Now, hell isn't really a place of punishment. Like I said, there's no fire. It's boring. It's underground. It's just sort of a shadow of our world, and you're stuck there. But it's not fiery torment. I mean, from a certain perspective, Valhalla might sound worse, because you are constrained to fight against all the other men who are there until only one is left, and then you're all resurrected at the end of the day to feast together. I mean, sounds kind of miserable. But no, I don't think that there's exactly like a sense of reward and punishment to either of these. Now and then in Norse myth, there's a character who is distinctly punished for something, like Loki is punished, depending on which source you read, either for contributing to the death of Balder or for just insulting the gods, by being tied up underground with serpent's poison dripping on his face. But, you know, there's not many people who are explicitly punished in some eternal way like that. It's an honor-shame culture rather than a virtue-sin culture. And honor is mostly a matter of martial glory.
Now, what kind of diversity of thought do we find in this tradition, both historically and presently?
I do think there's diversity of thought. I think that what I'm telling you, which is based on the Eddas, gives you a pretty good picture of what pre-Christian belief was like in Iceland late in the pre-Christian period, because that's exactly the stuff that would get passed down in poetry for the next couple centuries in Iceland. Now, in Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Norse colonies elsewhere, this stuff did not get written down, or if it did get written down, it didn't get passed on to us. It's a little bit here and there. There's a guy in the 1200s in Denmark named Saxo Grammaticus. I almost laugh every time I say that name, but he writes down a few of his own versions of some of these stories, and you can tell there's some really clear differences there. What's interesting is that he also says that a lot of his sources are Icelandic. So are the variations in his story because he's telling Danish versions, or is he actually hearing different Icelandic versions? It's a little hard for us to know now. But I have no doubt that, you know, Iceland in 900 had a very different idea about what gods did what than Sweden in 900 did, certainly than Sweden in 600 did. I don't think this was one stable picture. I think it shifted kaleidoscopically over time. One god becomes more powerful and more important. One place becomes less powerful, less important in another place. We see that in their names. For example, there's the god Tyr, Tyr, whose name is exactly linguistically, etymologically cognate with Zeus, but he's not an important god. In our stories, he has one story where he's important, and he's otherwise just a background figure. So, you know, if this is the Indo-European sky god, as some people would insist, I mean, it's a name, so who knows exactly how the name moved around. He's been way demoted. But we also just see it in place names, right? Sweden is full of places named for the god Fohr, whereas he's almost unknown in Iceland, and he doesn't show up in many of our stories there. So he was clearly a more important god there. So I think there was quite a bit of variation that way.
Do you think we find much diversity of thought on death and afterlife specifically in this tradition?
Yes, I think that originally hell was probably the afterlife for everyone. I think that Valhalla is a relatively late idea, and that's a pretty mainstream notion among Norse scholars. Part of why is that you actually see the word Valhalla just used of a earthly king's hall in poetry that's pretty early, like 800s, dated to the 800s by linguistic criteria. That makes it look like it's not a religious conception at that point. But then by the mid-900s, we have poems commemorating the death of Norwegian kings, whose deaths we can reasonably well time, so we can say pretty confidently we're talking about the mid-900s, that refer to Valhalla as explicitly this domain of Odin, where men go who have fallen in battle. So it seems like this probably develops in the, well, late 800s, early 900s as an idea and spreads, maybe not to everywhere. But you also see in just the way, just in idioms that people talk with, like a man who kills another man in a duel says, I'm going to send you to hell. Well, if you're being perfectly consistent with the picture that we get in the Eddas, you're sending him to Valhalla because you're killing him in battle. But, like the phrase clearly sticks, I'm sending you to hell. And then you have some stories, like I mentioned the saga of Hervor and Haedric, where the woman breaks into her father's burial mound and they call it hell. Well, he died in battle, so he should be in Valhalla, but that place is never mentioned, and the poem does seem to be based on a very old tradition. So, yeah, I think that it did change over time, and that Valhalla, for whatever reason, I mean, there's probably an interesting anthropological story there, grew up as a fairly new idea, but that originally much more like my understanding of Greek Hades, if you read, the Iliad, the Odyssey, or Sheol in the Old Testament, that it was more like there's a realm of the dead, and there's not much differentiation between them.
Okay, so if I wanted to go to hell in this religion, then what would I do? Do I need to do anything?
No, you don't need to do anything. Just die. Yeah. Just make sure you don't die fighting. So I guess if someone violently murders you, just take it. I mean, there's the great hero Sigurd there, who one of the great tragedies of Norse storytelling is that he goes to hell, not to Valhalla, because he's murdered in bed. So apparently, even being murdered by a weapon in bed does not count, right? You have to be standing up fighting, probably. Again, I don't think there's like terms and conditions that you have to sign for Valhalla, but that apparently would be among them. Yeah, so just die. And apparently, women only go to hell. Don't take that out of context. But in a Norse mythological context, yeah, there's no indication of women going to Valhalla after death. Although Valkyries, the women who serve Odin, serve in Valhalla, they don't seem to go there after they die, because there's a Valkyrie who dies in the Saga of the Volsungs and she goes to hell.
Well, it sounds like people who are watching this for a straightforward tutorial on how to go to hell, if you're a guy, then you might have a little work that you got to make sure you don't do. And yes. If you're not a guy, then it sounds like you're good. You made it.
You're set. Yeah. And I mean, if you're a god, there's also apparently pretty inconsistent rules about your ability to go back and forth, because gods and emissaries of the gods do travel to and from hell sometimes. So apparently, like, there's some travel possible, but probably not for us mortals.
All right, well, Dr. Jackson Crawford, thank you so much for joining me. I think this was really fun and educational.
Well, thank you very much.
Now, on to Shinto, the largest tradition on this list, practiced by tens of millions of people in Japan. My discussion with Dr. Kaitlyn Ugaretz on this was particularly fascinating for me because this is definitely the tradition I knew the least about going into this video.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Kaitlyn Ugaretz. I'm an instructor and associate editor at the Nanzan Institute for Religion and Culture in Nagoya, Japan. It's the fourth biggest city in Japan that no one's ever heard of. And what I do for my profession is I teach about Japanese religion, specifically Shinto, and I work on publishing journals and books about Japanese religion. Outside of my publishing job, I'm also a YouTuber myself. I'm very committed to making information about Japanese religion more accessible to people. So I run the YouTube channel Eat, Pray, Anime, where we explore Japanese religion and culture through our favorite popular media like anime and video games. And in my own research, I'm an anthropologist. So I work with people who practice Shinto in their daily lives, mostly outside of Japan, because interest in Shinto has grown a lot in the past couple of decades. And I learn what their views are of Shinto, how they practice, how it might be similar or different to how it works in Japan. So in a nutshell, that's what I work on. I'm an expert on Japanese religions, popular media, digital technology, and the environment.
My audience is primarily probably informed about religion through a, globally speaking, a more narrow lens. So a lot of people have a very, let's say, Protestant understanding of religion. And I really think that Shinto specifically breaks that mold and that understanding. It can be very difficult for kind of Protestant informed Americans to understand Shinto. So for people who don't know, what is Shinto?
That's a great question. Shinto is really hard to define because it's an umbrella term for a number of very local traditions that we now call Shinto. You can imagine that back in ancient times in Japan, there were different villages that lived in different areas in the mountains, by the ocean, and that their spirituality or their religion was influenced by the places where they lived. And then as society came together, they started sharing their ideas, and those ideas start to kind of cohere together into a tradition that we now call Shinto. If I had to define Shinto very briefly, I always say that it is a ritual tradition. So it's focused a lot more on practice than belief. Ritual practice based on venerating deities that we are called kami. So Shinto in Japanese actually means the way of the kami. So overall, you can think about it as a religious tradition that manages the relationship between these deities that can bless or punish people and humans and everything else in the environment, from, plants and landscapes. Kami, the deities in Shinto, are not outside of the world that we live in, but are actually immanent. They're here, present with us. And so through these rituals that you can do at Shinto shrines, we can express gratitude to those deities and ask for their help and things like that.
Can you paint us a picture of what happens when people die in Shinto?
Yeah, the concept of death in Shinto is really interesting because most people will tell you that Shinto is not really focused on death at all. It's often said that Shinto is a life-affirming tradition that focuses on what we do in this worldly life and not on sort of the next plane of existence or whatever happens during death. In the history of Japanese religion, Shinto and Buddhism have been closely intertwined for the majority of the recorded history that we have. And so there was kind of a division of labor in terms of religious practice and concepts. And so since Buddhism has such a robust philosophy or a way of thinking about what happens after death, many hells that you have covered before, Shinto didn't really have to come up with its own theology of what happens after death. And so because Shinto is an open and not exclusive tradition, you could do both Shinto and Buddhist things. And so the majority of people in Japan, for the majority of the history of Japan, have had Buddhist funerals, and Shinto focuses more on celebrating milestones in one's life and keeping people healthy and happy and fed and that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that Shinto doesn't have a concept of what happens after death. It's just that we don't have a lot of early sources on what people thought about death. And so the earliest kind of source we have on this topic comes from 712 CE. It's a document that was commissioned by the Japanese emperor basically to gather the mythology that supported his rule and his best friend's rule. So it's a narrative that was created with political ideas in mind. And these stories of the gods that are in this book called the Kojiki are very ambiguous in certain places, especially when talking about death. But there's one myth where we get kind of the quintessential idea of what happens when you die in the Kojiki. And this is a story of two kami, so two deities, Izanagi and Izanami. Izanagi is the brother husband and Izanami is the sister wife. And Izanami eventually dies after they create the land and all of these other deities. And so after she dies, Izanagi buries his wife. And he's very distraught, and he wants to visit her spirit, which has gone to the land of darkness or death, which is called Yomi. And when he goes to Yomi, he meets with his wife, and she says, I have to ask the lords, the other deities of this land, if it's okay for me to return with you to the land of the living. So she says, stay here. Don't do anything crazy. Like, don't try to look for me. I'll be right back. Izanagi can't wait, and so he fires up a torch, and when his wife comes back, he sees that she's just totally decaying and covered in like maggots and slime and super gross. And he runs away in fear, and she's so mad that he couldn't just follow directions and that he's embarrassed her, that she chases him basically out of the land of the dead. And there's a big chase scene, and he rolls a stone in front of this land of the dead. And that's kind of where we get the idea of how death happens, why people can't come back to life. And Izanami is so furious that she vows to kill 1,000 people a day. And Izanagi says, well, I will make sure that 1,500 people are born every day. And so we get this idea as well of how people die, but people are born so that traditions can continue, and we have ancestors and descendants and that sort of thing. So that's the general story of one place that people go when they die. But that's really it. We don't get any more details, like where is it? Not all of the gods who die in the Kojiki go to this land. So why did Izanami go there? We have no idea. It's super unclear. And philosophers and scholars of religion have tried to piece it together, but there are a lot of different competing theories about what happens. Something really important to know about Shinto is that death is actually a source of pollution. So ritual pollution and purity are really important in Shinto. In fact, after Izanagi in the mythology leaves the land of the dead, he immediately goes to a river and purifies himself. And in this like amazing magical act, 3 very important deities are born, including the sun goddess Amaterasu, who's the ancestress of the Japanese imperial lines. This is a really foundational myth for the Japanese state in the ancient period and even today and during World War II. And so at Shinto shrines, the priests are not supposed to come into contact with death. They're not really supposed to engage in funerals and that sort of thing. All of the death-related aspects for most of history were dealt with by Buddhist temples instead.
So let me see if I have something right here. A lot of people over the last 1,000 years may have engaged in aspects of Shinto and Buddhism. Mm-hmm. And so that might mean that it doesn't sound like there would be any sort of concept of a hell or something like that within Shinto. People who did practice Shinto might have believed in Buddhist hells or had some sort of practice or mythology or tradition that related to hell, but in Buddhism. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So Shinto doesn't have a concept of hell. They leave that up to Buddhism, which has a much more robust idea of what happens after you die. And so because there's this land of the dead, Yomi, that people can go to, there's no moral judgment involved in it. It's not a thing like you were bad in life, so you go to the land of darkness. It's just kind of how it is. So because people can, I don't want to use the word believe, but because people can practice both Shinto and Buddhism, and because Buddhism has more ideas and concepts of how to deal with death, we tend to see death de-emphasized in Shinto.
So what kind of diversity of thought do we find about death in this tradition? Do we have one story, but a lot of other people may have divergent interpretations of this story, or what's going on here with the diversity of thought?
Yeah, there's so much diversity actually in ideas about death and where people go, where they die in Shinto. So because there's this history of Buddhism dealing with death, many people who practice Shinto have told me, oh, Shinto doesn't have anything to do with death. Like there's barely any ideas. But historically, there are actually a lot of competing ideas. So for example, it's really unclear where Yomi is and what type of place it is. Philosophers in Japan have been arguing about this for centuries. Is it an underground place, like Hades? Is it another realm that's kind of within this world? Is it invisible? Does the land of the dead overlap with where we live? And I mean, people have had some pretty big beefs on this topic in the history of studying Shinto. And Yomi isn't even the only land where people go when they die. There's a place called Ne-no-kuni, which is sort of some original land. There's Tokoyo, which is some far-off place either across or below the sea. And people had ideas about people going, the spirits of ancestors going up to the mountains in very ancient times. So because Shinto is kind of this collection of different local traditions, you can see that like villages that were near the coast had ideas about the dead going across or under the ocean because that's close to them, whereas people who live further in the forests or the mountains would think that, you know, their dead spirits would go somewhere else. In the 1700s, there was a lot of concern when Japan came into closer contact with ideas from Christianity and the West. Where do our people go when they die? Just in Shinto tradition. And so a lot of people came up with ideas. One very famous one is a philosopher or intellectual called Hirata Atsutane. And he believed, counter to a lot of people that came before him, that there's actually an invisible world that overlaps with the world that we live in. And so when people die, instead of going to some dark place far away, the spirits of our ancestors and the people that we love are actually very close to us, and that they watch over us. And not only do they become spirits when they die, but they become kami themselves. They become deities. And so by following Shinto traditions, we not only honor, the sun goddess and the deities that give us food and, all of the good things in life, but also that the people, our loved ones, we can also pray to them and that they can help us as well. And this probably is related to the fact that when he was writing his big ideas down, his wife had died recently. And he wrote in his diary, I really feel like she's here with me. And so there are all of these different lands in Shinto where the dead can go. And it's kind of unclear where people go and why they go there. But it's generally a positive thing. It's not like, well, you were bad in life, so you go to Yomi. And you were good in life, so you can kind of stick around and become a god yourself. But again, because Buddhism has such a strong presence in Japan, these ideas about different lands in Shinto are not super well known, even to people who practice Shinto. Because the main thing that you do in this tradition is that you go to shrines and you say thank you for the things that you're grateful for, and you ask for the things that you need or that you want, and then you go home. So there's not a lot of focusing on what happens after you die. It's more of a focus on living a good life in this life. That doesn't mean that Shinto doesn't have ideas about divine punishment or that there is no judgment. There are ideas of taboos and pollution that just happen by living in the world and doing things that are against social norms, like don't murder, that's bad in Shinto. That's a source of pollution, just like death is. But it's not that there are sins that sort of follow you into death. Instead, when you practice Shinto ritual, the first thing that you do is you purify yourself. And so basically, the bad things that happen in life can stick to you like mud or dust. I often say like dust is the bad stuff that you can't avoid even by living a good life. And mud is the thing that you can kind of try to avoid and don't track it into the house. But both of those can be purified through Shinto. So there's less of a worry about I have to live a good life right now because something bad will happen to me later, but just to live a good life right now because you want a good life right now.
Yeah, I want to kind of pull on the thread of how ethics are tied to intervention from divinity or deities. So in Abrahamic traditions, it's especially in Christianity and Islam, what you do is very much a determining factor on where you go, right? That's pretty central. It's a pretty big deal for most people in those traditions, at least. And with Shinto, it sounds like there is obviously an idea or a framework for ethics, but it's not connected to or directly determining where you're going to go when you die. Can you kind of discuss the way that ethics and intervention from divinity or deity might be connected?
Sure. So there's a common saying that Shinto has no founder, no doctrine, and no sacred texts. This is a bit of an overstatement, I think. There have been people who have shaped Shinto thought, like Hirata Atsutane that I mentioned. And although there's no doctrine, there's no Bible in Shinto that you can go to that tells you, okay, this is what you need to do. This is what the gods say you need to do. Instead, we have to interpret what the ethics or the kind of the moral code of Shinto is from the rituals that we have. Really, the only things that we have from ancient Shinto are these myths that I mentioned are very biased in terms of there were political gains to be made for telling certain stories and not others. And then there are sort of the prayers and the practices of Shinto itself that focus on the agricultural calendar, making sure that people have enough food to eat. So a lot of Shinto ritual is based on gratitude, and we can extrapolate from that and stories of how somebody, an emperor in ancient times did something improper. The gods got mad at him and made him sick and die. We can kind of extrapolate from that. Okay, you shouldn't be mean to your subjects. You shouldn't kill people willy-nilly. You shouldn't disrespect the kami, the deities. But because there's no sort of 10 commandments of you cannot do this and that, there isn't a clear manual for how to live your life. And because there are so many different ideas of where people go when they die, and most of that was handled by Buddhism, which again has a very robust sort of moral philosophy, we don't see that so much in Shinto. There is some historical research that shows that over time, the idea that the gods punish people has sort of decreased, and instead the image of the deities has become less scary and more happy fuzzy. And so there's this idea that instead of avoiding things that will make the deities mad, we should just do things that are pleasant to the deities and that they will help us. And so because there's almost there's a very practical approach to Shinto, it doesn't have a lot to say about how to live your life in order to have a better afterlife. It's really not a concern in Shinto at all.
This is how to go to hell in every religion. So I am wondering, how do I get to the netherworld if I want to go? And if I can't actually determine that myself in any way, is there any way that I can at least incur divine punishment or wrath?
Yeah, so because Shinto doesn't have a hell per se, one answer is that you can't go to hell. So congratulations, or maybe sorry, you can't get into every place. But it's also a very simple answer. You just die. So you don't have to do anything special. Someday we will all die, and you will go to one of the netherworlds, whether it's Yomi or Tokoyo or Nenokuni. So congratulations, you've already met the bar. You're all set.
What about divine punishment here on Earth?
Oh, yes. Well, You can murder people and hang around corpses and be covered in blood and just generally be a nasty neighbor to people. That should do the trick.
Well, see, my problem is that this is really more of a tourism video, and divine punishment here on Earth is not really a seeing of the sights. So maybe people just need to go to Japan and learn about Shinto and realize that, regardless of what they do, they're going to the same netherworld as anybody else, potentially, hypothetically. So if you want to do some tourism here, you're not going to Shinto hell, guys. You're going to just have to book a plane ticket.
Speaking of tourism, if you do want to physically go to hell before you die, there are actually many places in Japan that claim to be the entrance to Yomi. One of the most famous ones is in Izumo. There are also places that are called literally hell in Japan. So if you want to go to a hellish hot spring or sort of a cave in the woods, you can go right now and you don't even have to die.
Wow. That's amazing. Okay, I like that. That actually sounds like the most pleasant version of hell that I've heard about so far. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Now, don't get discouraged. Yeah, you can't go to hell in Shinto, but in the next religion we'll cover, Jainism, let's just say it's easy to get in. For this one, I spoke to Dr. Sherry Fohr.
I taught world religions, about various religions for over 20 years before I recently retired. My specialty is Jainism, and that's where my graduate school work focused. For that, I spent a year in India with Jains. I've spent a lot of time with Jains. And from there, I've taught mostly sort of Asian religions, world religions, and Jainism in the higher education, where I was an associate professor until recently. Also, though, too, I founded an interfaith studies program with a colleague, Reverend Jason Lasciuto, who's now moved on also into nonprofit to basically promote understanding between people who are religious and not religious, or various religions.
So for those of us who don't know, what is Jainism?
Okay, so Jainism developed in India, was founded and developed in India alongside Hinduism and Buddhism, and so it has some similarities with Hinduism and Buddhism. For example, there's the world of reincarnation, and so in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, you don't have just one life to live, you have many lives to live. And you can be reborn as a human, as an animal, and this is true in Hinduism and South Asian Buddhism as well. Jainism adds some other things to that, like microscopic organisms, fire, water, the elements, and plants. Then there's also karma, and that's in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. So karma is basically you punish and reward yourself. You do something bad stuff will happen to you. If you do something good to others, and similarly good stuff will happen to you. But in Jainism, these are particles, microscopic particles that actually stick to your soul until they produce a result. And that's one of the differences. Then also, like Hinduism, there's a divine soul. And so in Jainism, every soul, whether insect, microscopic organism, a person, any type of animal, has 4 divine qualities: infinite perception, infinite knowledge, infinite bliss, and infinite energy or power. And so every single living being is divine. And therefore, every single living being should not be harmed, right? And there's no creator God, just like in South Asian Buddhism in particular as well. And so there is an emphasis in Jainism on avoiding bad karma and purifying the karma you already have on your soul, to uncover the soul and uncover those 4 divine qualities, and therefore achieve nirvana, kind of similar to Buddhism, but maybe not exactly the same. And so basically to stop accumulating karma, bad karma in particular, the focus is on non-harming. It's on truth. It's on not stealing. It's on chastity, no sexual misconduct, it's on non-possession or non-attachment. And so basically, like for example, non-possession, non-attachment. If you have a lot of money, don't be too attached to it, right? And don't accumulate it to the point where you're crushing other people with your wealth, right? Like give yourself a limit and give a lot to charity, right? And so you can, even if you have wealth, you can avoid harming others by giving yourself certain ethical guidelines within that. Now, monks and nuns for that one don't have any possessions except exact what they need. But lay people are allowed to enjoy wealth as long as they're not hurting other people in the process, and they give themselves limits and give a lot to charity. And Jains give a lot to charity. Jain laymen tend to be kind of wealthy, and they give a lot to charity. They help during famines, for example, in India. They have in the past, right? Okay, so non-harming, though, what is that? Non-harming or non-violence, ahimsa. Monks and nuns practice this in body, speech, and mind. So they do not harm any living being. Try not to. It's impossible not to harm any living being all the time. But no harsh speech, right? So an example of this would be trolling on the internet right now. That would be harsh speech, okay? So this is supposed to be avoided, all right? And then, but also non-harming in your mind, so not thinking of like hatred or anger towards any living being, you know? So in fostering a feeling of friendship for all living beings along the way. And so this kind of helps with the mind element of it, because the stronger the emotions in the mind, that acts as more glue for these karmic particles, which cling to the soul, and then will have a karmic result that will be greater. So if you are a very angry, hateful person and you are harming others, the end result will be greater than if you weren't angry, hateful person, if that makes sense.
So I and a lot of my viewers grew up in a pretty ethics-focused religious place, and this was the ethical actions and deeds that we were supposed to do or things we were supposed to not do was really tied up in our view of cosmology. You know, I don't want to do this because I want to go to the good place, not the bad place when I die. We didn't have this kind of idea of particles, or there's no idea of samsara. This is just kind of, this is a test here on Earth. You end up here, you end up here. I'm sensing that this is not exactly what we're talking about in Jainism when it comes to, you know, death, rebirth. What happens when someone dies? How is ethics related to that? Is it related to that?
It definitely is related to that. So what happens to you after you die depends entirely on your ethics while you were alive. So where you were reborn, what you're reborn as, will depend entirely on your good and bad deeds in this life and in your previous lives. So when you die, you are reborn. You're reborn elsewhere. It could be in one of the heavens, it could be in one of the hells, it could be in this middle, what's called the middle realm, as a human or an animal. And then you live out the rest of your life as far as that good or bad karma lasts until it all goes away from the soul. And then you're reborn elsewhere. And this goes on over and over and over and over and over again. Interestingly, in Jainism, there's kind of this idea that, you know, no matter how good someone can end up, okay, like the founders of Jainism, it's hard to get better than the founder of Jainism, right? They've had stints in hell, the founders of Jainism, right?
Huh.
Yeah. So in the narrative traditions, there's like, this is what happened. You know, this is why they went to hell. And it has to do with, like, you know, fighting in wars, right? Until they sort of learned their lessons and then got into this path of nonviolence. Yeah.
Interesting. So we'll keep with a few other questions before we really get into this, but I'm just thinking right now, it'd be really easy for me to get in at this point. And very basically impossible for me to get out or not be in for some length of time, it sounds like.
And also, like, Jains, you know, they very much advocate for vegetarianism because according to, some Jains, eating meat, not being a vegetarian, that could land you a rebirth in hell, right?
Interesting.
Because it's
Yeah.
all living beings matter. All living beings matter. Yeah.
I mean, I am an ethical vegan. I'm not always perfectly observant, but that's interesting. While I don't have the cosmological incentive there, I do understand where the motivation comes from in other ways.
Yeah. And my students, when I taught Jainism, they really enjoyed learning about this part, because more and more my students were becoming vegans, basically. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so there's got to be diversity in this tradition, as there are in all traditions, right? So what kind of diversity of thought do we find, especially on death, reincarnation, hell in Jainism?
Yeah, surprisingly little.
Really?
Yes. I smiled at that question when you sent it to me. It's very little, very little. Yeah. I cannot think of something that would be significant enough and not so kind of like nuanced in a way that's not relevant to this particular conversation to be really, really perhaps boring to you. But no.
Huh, interesting. I mean, do people get into significant disagreement about, like, for the founders of Jainism, for instance, some people think, no, they didn't really go to hell, or they went for a really short amount of time. And other people think they went for a longer amount of time. Do we see any disagreement like that?
I'm not aware of a disagreement about that. I mean, there are disagreements among Jains. There's the Digambar sect and Shwetambar sect, and one of the disagreements there has to do with the conduct of monks and nuns, and whether or not women can achieve the end state, which is moksha or nirvana, right? But not so much about hell. Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. Okay, so how does one end up in hell? What's the process? What makes it more likely you're going to spend a longer amount of time, something like that?
Okay, so engaging in killing others, for example, war, but also eating meat, for example. There's so many different types of rebirths that it's not a black and white thing, it's a shade of gray, in that everybody has an accumulation already of some good and bad karma even before this life, right? And so where you would end up would depend on that mix of good and bad karma and what is coming to the surface, I suppose, right now. But mainly I'd say it's pretty simple: killing. Killing gets you a rebirth in hell, and significant amounts of killing of not just humans, but also animals. Mm-hmm.
Right. And I, maybe this shows my ignorance, but I thought that Jains typically, or at least ones that are more observant, don't do like fermented foods, things like that, because of microorganisms. Is that a form of killing as well? Like consuming something that's fermented has microorganisms in it?
Right. Yeah. So that is true of many Jains. Nothing fermented. Monks and nuns, they don't even drink water that hasn't been boiled first and filtered, because they need to filter out the beings in the water, right? Lay people, before they give them the water, people who are not monks and nuns, regular householders, boil the water before giving it to them. And so the lay people get the bad karma from doing that, but there's so much more good karma that's involved in supporting monks and nuns who are on this path of nonviolence, right, that it's worth it to them. There's some monks and nuns also only in the dark will have soft brooms in which they will sweep the ground as they walk, if they can't see, to avoid insects, right? Or when they roll over at night. Now, the bad karma you get from killing something that doesn't have many senses to suffer as much, okay, is not as great as if you killed something that had more senses, that made, like sight, hearing, taste, smell, like, more senses to suffer more. So therefore, even though plants are alive, plants don't have as many senses as animals, And so it's less violent to eat plants than it is animals.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that actually aligns relatively well with my thinking about ethics when it comes to the things that I eat. So I wonder, do you have any insight on why people who are, maybe your students or people like me who are raised in a kind of more Protestant ethics focused culture might be coming to kind of, I guess for lack of a better term, vibe with Jainism?
I don't know, but there's a sort of softening in our culture that's happening that I find heartening. Those of us who are older, a lot of us went through a period when we were taught that animals didn't matter. So when we witnessed violence against them, right, that we were taught to be okay with that. This was like basically a bit traumatic for me as a child, because I did not make that differentiation between me and animals as a child, right? And I think, I'm not sure, younger people are questioning things in ways that when I was, younger, we just went along to get along, And I think that there's a shift towards kindness that I think Jains would be really happy about, except for the trolling. What is with the trolling, But otherwise there is a shift towards kindness, So in some ways, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so final question here. I don't want to ask you to make too solid of a diagnosis, maybe go off your intuition here, but as someone who is an ethical vegan like myself, but ate meat and all of the things, I guess I still do drink beer, so that's fermented foods. But a typical Westerner, honestly, who has typical Western ethics that tries their best, but definitely does step on bugs and things sometimes. Is it likely within this thinking that I would have at least a stint in hell?
It's likely you've already had one, according to Jainism. It's usually in the narratives, it's people mess up karmically and they go through this harmful stage in their past lives before they get to a stage where like, oh, kindness is the way, right? So, that's my take on it. But I think it isn't black and white. There's shades of gray, and everybody has a mix of good and bad karma. And there are plenty of in between places. Like you can be reborn as a human, but have bad health, right? Mm. You know what I mean? Or be reborn as a human, but in poverty. So like all punishment, you can be reborn as an animal, and a particular animal that has to watch their back because of, prey. Other animals might be after them, right? Or you could be reborn as an elephant which nothing eats, and nothing hunts except maybe the occasional human, right? Well, yeah, so with the ivory, right? So maybe that's not such a good example, but yeah. So there's all kinds of, places in between, yeah.
Interesting. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Dr. Sherry Fohr, thank you so much for enlightening us today. And where can people find any of your work, or at least more resources to dig into Jainism?
Okay, so I guess I'll shamelessly plug my book. So this is my book. This is Guides for the Perplexed is like the Dummies Guides, but it's the sophisticated European version. So this is an introduction to Jainism, but there's plenty of other people have written lovely things too. Yeah.
Well, you can just send me some links to different things, and I'll put them in the description so people can go check them out.
All right. Well, and it's a pleasure, and it was a pleasure, and I wish you luck in your project here. I think it's great. If you were one of my students, I'd be like totally giving you an A. Yeah.
Now, finally, let's talk religion. Yeah, that's right. Filip Holm of the incredible religious studies channel Let's Talk Religion is my final guest. he spoke to me about Zoroastrianism, which probably has the oldest idea of hell out of any religion in the world. Yeah, while every other religion I've covered up to this point is old, they're not, in fact, old as hell. Okay, Filip, for those who don't know, what is Zoroastrianism?
So Zoroastrianism is a religion, an ancient religion that flourished primarily in what is Iran, right, Central Asia. It is traced usually to a figure called Zarathustra, also known as Zoroaster in Greek, who lived at some point in the distant past. Scholars are unsure exactly when to date him, although I think many scholars, there's a sort of consensus today that he lived maybe around the year 1500 BC. So this is a very long time ago. And he authored this text or these hymns, these songs or poems called the Gathas, which was the earliest scriptures of what became Zoroastrianism, and became especially prominent with the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire, around 500 BC, when the religion, or at least some early form of the religion, was adopted by the Achaemenid kings, the famous ones like Cyrus the Great, and Darius, and Xerxes, etc. And so this religion, because the Persian Empire was so important and so major and spread across different regions, Zoroastrianism as a religion or a system of thought and ritual, as diverse as it was, because it was diverse and changed, it also spread and flourished in these regions, not just in Iran and Central Asia, but also exerted influence in the Middle East, possibly all the way to like Egypt to some degree, because the Persians obviously conquered major areas of that sort of Mediterranean region. And at the core of the Zoroastrian worldview is a kind of cosmological dualism, a vertical dualism. This is not sort of the Descartian or Cartesian dualism of spirit versus body, or mind and body, nor is it the kind of Gnostic dualism necessarily. It's a vertical dualism where all of the world, material and spiritual realities, are divided into two sort of realms, you could say. One which is called Asha, which means order and justice, that which is right and truth. That's on the one hand, that's sort of the good part, the good aspect of reality. And then there's the dark aspect of reality, that is its opposite, which is represented by this force called Druj, which means the lie or the deception. And these two forces are also represented by certain divine figures. Sometimes Zoroastrianism is referred to as a monotheistic religion because it argues that there is one divine sort of creative principle, one god, creative god called Ahura Mazda, which means the wise lord, or the lord of wisdom. And he is the sort of main representative and reality behind the good aspect of reality, Asha, right? He represents and rules over that. Whereas the dark and evil aspect of the world is ruled by this force called Angra Mainyu, which means destructive spirit, basically. And there is some disagreement also on how this should be read, and if Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu are almost seen as two opposing deities or gods in a certain sense. Angra Mainyu and Ahura Mazda are also accompanied by certain divine figures on either side. Ahura Mazda will have these beings called the Yazadas, which are sort of gods or lower divine beings, as well as other beings referred to as the Amesha Spentas, which sometimes are seen as sort of attributes of God that are also often represented as kind of divine anthropomorphic figures sometimes. On the other hand, Angra Mainyu is accompanied by evil spirits, evil companions or lower beings called devas. So much of the corpus of texts were at least written down during the Sasanian Empire. This is like a few centuries AD, when religions like Christianity, Islam had already appeared. And some argue that these scriptures were codified at this time, sort of in response to these new systematic religions that were starting to challenge Zoroastrianism in different ways. So this is important that when we read Zoroastrianism, we often project ideas of these later scriptures and ideas onto the earlier Zoroastrian religion, which might not always be accurate, because again, the religion will have changed over time. And so whenever we try to understand things like hell or the afterlife, these aspects need to be kept in mind, that there are some gaps and there's nuance and complexity to how to understand the religion in that sense.
Now, what happens when people die in this tradition? Can you paint us a picture of that?
Yeah, so because there's this strong dualism, human beings are called to work for the benefit of Asha, of truth and justice in the world, and to work against the forces of Druj. And so when the human being dies, the soul of the human being, which is called the Urvan, becomes reunited with a sort of higher self called the Fravashi. This is very complicated. I don't even understand the complexity of this myself. But what happens is that the soul is then, after death, forced to walk across a bridge. And this bridge, on the other side of this bridge, is basically sort of angelic figures, for all intents and purposes. They will sort of take you to the heavenly, beautiful realm called the House of Songs, where you'll be in the presence of the light of Ahura Mazda, and sort of this basically like paradisial world state. Whereas at the bottom of this this bridge, underneath the bridge, is a terrible place called the House of Lies, which is the place where the devas, the sort of evil spirits, dwell. It's a dark, lonely place. It's cold and dark and scary and smells bad. And so the soul after death is forced to walk across this bridge. And so if he has been a righteous person, if he has worked for the benefit of Asha, truth and justice in the world, this bridge will be very wide and easy to cross. And he might even be escorted by divine beings. If, however, he has been a bad person, then the bridge will sort of contract to be very, very narrow, like a razor's edge, it is said in one text, right? So that it's basically impossible to cross. So inevitably, this person will instead fall down into this place called the House of Lies, right? Which is very close to what later Abrahamic traditions would call hell, basically. And so they will be tormented in this House of Lies. And so that is the sort of point in time that we are in now, where the world is a sort of combination of both Asha and Druj. Eventually, though, at the end of time, there will be an event called Freshu Kareti, which is when the world will become purified completely. All the evil aspects, the Druj in the world, will have been dispelled, and the world will be once again perfect. This will be inaugurated by the coming of a kind of messianic figure called the Seoshant. And at this point, the dead, the souls of the dead, will be resurrected into their bodies, the bodies that they had before they died, and there will be a kind of last judgment. Right, so even after they've spent time in paradise or hell, they will be resurrected, and there will be a final judgment, where in one text it says that they will have to go through a kind of trial where they sort of have to wade through molten lava, basically, I think is what the text says. And for the righteous people, again, that will be very easy, whereas for not righteous people, it would be a very difficult thing. So this, at this point, evil is destroyed. Angra Mainyu is returned to oblivion, and the world is perfect, and the righteous people get to stay in this perfect world of Ahura Mazda. Now, it's unclear what happens to the not righteous people, the evil people. There are some traditions where it seems that the most evil people that are sort of unredeemable basically also become completely destroyed. They are sort of sent into oblivion. Whereas in other traditions or sources, it seems to indicate that even the most evil people, when they have spent all this time in hell and they have gone through all these trials, eventually everyone will be saved, so to say. One will get to be part of this perfect world of Ahura Mazda.
So are ethical practices tied to ideas of where you go when you die? You know, the Abrahamic religions are that way, but is that the case here too?
So yes, that's one of the things that is so fascinating about Zoroastrianism, is that where you go after you die is very much connected to your ethical practices, like how you have acted in this life. And that seems to have been a quite innovative idea at that time compared to many other religious traditions in antiquity.
Okay, so I have received some comments saying that Christianity and Islam just kind of lifted their ideas of heaven and hell directly from Zoroastrianism. Did Zoroastrian eschatology really influence the eschatology of Abrahamic faiths, though?
Yeah, so this influence of Zoroastrianism on the Abrahamic religions is one of the most perhaps interesting and most widely discussed aspects and questions regarding this religion. It's often stated that all these ideas about heaven and hell, the final judgment, angels and demons, that they all come originally from Zoroastrianism and sort of made their way into, first of all, Judaism, and then through that especially into Christianity and Islam, where these concepts become very important aspects of those religions. And so we have to sort of consider that all the different religious traditions at that time were very much neighbors with each other. They interacted with each other in different ways, and they influenced each other back and forth. There isn't necessarily this one-way street of, Zoroastrianism influencing all these religions. It's very likely that many aspects of Zoroastrianism were also influenced in different ways by these other religions, like Judaism, perhaps, and Christianity, and maybe even Islam to some degree. So that's, I think, important to sort of keep in mind, that it's more complicated usually with these things, that there isn't just a sort of clear one way that these things go, but it's a sort of dialogue back and forth. I mean, sometimes it's very obvious. You can see a very clear sort of imagery that is very similar. This idea of the bridge that you have to cross with hell at the bottom is basically found in an identical way in the Islamic tradition, in the hadiths. It's called the sirat, the way, the bridge, where the people also have to sort of cross this bridge, and for the evil person, it becomes like the blade's edge and impossible to cross, essentially. So in those cases, it's hard to deny that there's probably a sort of historical influence going on.
Okay, now the question we've all been waiting for: why and how does one go to hell or incur divine punishment in Zoroastrianism?
So generally, as I said, the dualism of this religious worldview is at the center of all of this. The person is asked to work for the benefit of and to represent Asha, so truth and justice in the world, and to fight against druj, falsehood, lies, these kinds of things. The person who accomplishes that, who is successful in this, he becomes known as an Ashavan, whereas the one who is not successful, who rather works for evil in the world, he becomes a Dregvant, so-called. You can sort of infer certain things, right? So druj, for example, one of the influences of druj in the world is death and decay. So an obvious thing not to do is to kill people, right? To murder and to cause decay and death in the world. That would be to work for druj, for falsehood. You can also sense in a sort of, in the name druj, which means lie, sort of falsehood, deception, that to lie and deceive people is very much to promote druj. And that would cause you very much to be punished after death. So don't murder people, don't lie, don't deceive people. There are certain animals that are associated with druj, like snakes and frogs. So in some texts, it seems like you're sort of encouraged to actually kill those animals and get rid of them to sort of further Asha in the world and purity. Also very important that you are not supposed to defile pure things. This seems to be a great offense, a great sin in the religion. So two very good examples of things that are seen as almost completely pure entirely pure in the religion is fire and water, especially running water. Fire is very famously an important symbol for Zoroastrianism because it represents purity. It represents this sort of light and purity of Asha. For example, the Zoroastrians wouldn't burn dead bodies because dead bodies, dead flesh is seen as very impure and as representative of Druj. So to defile fire or water with dead bodies is an enormous no-no. So that's one way that you could possibly end up in hell. There are also indications and references to sexual sins. Not exactly sure precisely what that means. I suppose that would be common to what we find in other traditions, like, maybe not to have sex outside of a marriage, and these kinds of things. There's also an important indication. I think this is in a text by Herodotus, the famous Greek historian. He seems to indicate that the Iranians, the Persians, they put a lot of importance and emphasis on being a warrior. There was a sort of a warrior culture to some degree. And part of the sort of ethics of this religion seems to have been to be a good warrior, perhaps also a sort of to be chivalrous, right? To be a just warrior. And in the case of a king, it was his responsibility to be a just king in order to promote Asha in the world. But if you are too much in the camp of Druj and you spread this sort of deceit and falsehood and impurity in the world, then that bridge that you have to cross is going to be very, very tiny, and you're probably going to have to spend some time, at least some time, in that foul-smelling, lonely, dark house of lies, which probably is the sort of origin of hell in some ways.
Well, this group of religions was quite the mixed bag as compared to the major world religions I covered before. It looks like I'm going to hell in some of these no matter what I do, and in others there's no way in at all. What about you, though? How many hells are you going to? And which one do you think you'll want to stop by first? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much to everyone who helped make this video possible. Dr. Dan McClellan, Dr. Jackson Crawford, Dr. Kaitlyn Ugaretz, Dr. Sherry Fohr, and Filip Holm. You'll find links to all of their excellent work in the description. And thank you for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to support my work, subscribe and check out the religious studies courses I produce with Dr. Joseph Laycock. Should be attached to the video below. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.